So welcome everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Drew Shunt. I am the legislative chair of the HIV Justice Coalition. And right off the bat, I think we're gonna hear from Representative Chris Finelli, who is a sponsor of two bills that would greatly improve HIV policy in Missouri, one of which is the priority bill that we'll be talking about today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to him.
Hey, Drew, sorry my camera's not on, but I hope you all can hear me. So there's good developments with both of those pieces of legislation, one which would allow post-exposure prophylaxis medicines to be dispensed by a pharmacist without a prescription. And that has had quite a bit of success. It was voted out of the House unanimously fairly recently, and it's out of the Senate companion is out of the Committee on Health over on the Senate side and was recently added to a House bill on the Senate floor as an amendment. And so it's got a really good chance of running all of the hoops at this juncture. I'm feeling somewhat confident about it, and it will continue to be added to other vehicles that are moving around the House and Senate, and the original bills themselves are both fairly far along in the process. And so there's a lot of avenues remaining for success there. As far as the modernization language as it relates to the criminal code, that one is on the House calendar. It was voted out of two committees on the House side and one committee on the Senate side. I believe it's also on the Senate calendar, but it has not passed either chamber on the floor yet. But Senator Rader and I are going to continue to try to add that to different vehicles as amendments. And we're going to see if we can get both of those pieces of legislation done in the 3 weeks that we have remaining. And so that's where we stand on the bills. And overall, they've been fairly successful, especially if you compare it to most of the legislation that gets filed. Keep in mind that there's probably over 1,500 bills, and very few of them make it this far. So I feel really good about where we're at, and going to continue working on it for the remaining weeks of session.
Perfect. Thanks for stopping by and joining us today.
Happy to do it.
Perfect. And just as to get started here, we'll talk about the background of Empower Missouri just briefly. For those of you who aren't familiar, Empower Missouri is now, I believe, over 100 years old, and they have been fighting for the rights of Missourians. And a lot of the focus is on housing security, food security, and criminal justice reform, and it happens to be the home of the HIV Justice Coalition. So the HIV Justice Coalition was founded by two women in Kansas City about close to 10 years ago now, really to address the issue that Missouri's HIV laws are really problematic, which we'll get into in a little bit. We are now housed in Empower Missouri, and as we start to make progress on the HIV criminalization issue, I think a lot of members are really hoping that we're going to be able to expand in the coming years to focus on really being a voice for HIV policy on a variety of issues that affect Missourians living with HIV. So as part of this series this week, we are doing a little bit of Advocacy 101. So on Monday, we heard from, I forget who was which day, but the first day we heard about really finding your passion, really how you can be more effective and avoid burnout if you really hone down on a few issues that you're really passionate about. On Tuesday, we learned a little bit about some of the actual nuts and bolts of how a law gets passed. And then Wednesday, we really learned about how to effectively talk with your legislators, really become their go-to person as an expert on a particular issue. And then today we're going to talk about working in coalitions, which is very appropriate given that we are a coalition ourselves. So first, what is a coalition? It is generally a group of individuals and or organizations that come together to work on a particular project or issue. So this can mean, like for instance, Empower Missouri and ACLU of Missouri are different organizations with different missions, but there is some overlap in what issues the two organizations care about. So they might form a coalition along with other organizations to address a particular issue that falls within that overlap. So then why work in coalition? I mean, the short answer is we're stronger together. More numbers is often helpful, and we all bring different things to the table. For instance, different organizations have different resources, different, like in terms of talents, relationships, money. As individuals, we have different skills, availability, relationships, and perspectives and life experience, which I think is a really important piece here. If we make sure that we have diverse coalitions, we can make sure that we are crafting policy and addressing issues in a way that doesn't leave any communities behind. Um, for instance, a good example is when I first came into this space, coming from a person who is was in college and had access to health insurance. I was really concerned about making sure people who are able to achieve an undetectable viral load aren't being caught up in this law. And other people reminded me that not everyone has access to healthcare, and we need to make sure that we are not leaving people who are struggling with healthcare availability, making sure we're not leaving them behind. And by being in the same coalition together, we were able to get on the same page and make sure that like our advocacy was coordinated and not negatively impacting other communities that we may not have considered only coming from our own personal perspective. So then how to work in coalition? One of the biggest things I think is really talking to people and building relationships and building trust. And this is for a couple reasons. Number one, in how I mentioned that we all have different resources and skills and things that we bring to the table, we're not going to know who has what skills and resources until we actually understand who we're working with and understanding, um, for instance, when an issue comes up and I need particular resources, let's say I have a legal question that comes up and I don't have legal skills to address that issue. If I know everyone that I'm working with really well, I would know who to turn to when I have that issue come up. And also building trust is really important because we can't all be everywhere all the time. That's just not how the world works. So being able to build trust to know that when we need to delegate tasks or someone is operating on our behalf of the coalition, that we fully trust that they have our best interest in mind and that they know what they're doing. And then also building trust to know that we can have difficult conversations. We're all really passionate about these issues. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't show up um, all the time like we do. So when passions are high, it can be really difficult to have these challenging conversations. But if we know people on a personal level and actually get to know people, we can better have those conversations and know that we are operating in good faith and have each other's best interests in mind, which really helps us move forward together as a coalition. So I know this might be a review for a lot of people, but I wanted to move into just an overview of where HIV is today so that we can fully get a common background, because I think that's a really important foundation for understanding the issues of HIV policy in Missouri. So number one, HIV is incredibly treatable now. I know that um, there's a lot of perception amongst people who haven't paid attention to the HIV epidemic since it really came onto the scene in the 80s and 90s, that there's this perception that it's a death sentence or that it's like extremely has extremely negative consequences on someone's health. That's only true if it's not treated. We now have treatments available that with 1 pill a day, you can actually reduce levels of the virus so low in your body that tests do not detect the virus. Um, an important component of that is when you reach that undetectable level, you cannot transmit the virus. Um, this is a really important piece because that means if we can get people onto treatment and reach that undetectable viral load, we can reduce transmission. What that means, though, is that we need to get people tested and we need to get people treated. Um, and another component to this is the preventative medications are now available. You heard Representative Chris Finelli mention that he has a bill that would increase access to these medications. That would, if it were passed, it would actually make these drugs available in pharmacies. But what these drugs are is one, there's a pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is a once daily pill. If you are part of a community that's considered to be more vulnerable to HIV infection, you can take a once daily pill and it's highly effective at preventing transmission. The other medication that I think is more surprising to a lot of people is there's actually a post-exposure prophylaxis. So if you were exposed to HIV, there's actually a 72-hour window where you can begin an medication regimen to prevent transmission. So you actually have a 72-hour window after um, an exposure to still prevent transmission. So knowing all of this is, I think, is an important foundation to understand why our current laws are really outdated because they were enacted in a time when not all of this is true. So turning to what Missouri's actual laws are currently. So the first one is the main piece when we talk about HIV criminalization is Missouri's HIV exposure law. So in Missouri, if you are living with HIV and you know your status and you don't tell a person your status before engaging in a range of activities, some of these activities don't actually carry a risk of transmission, which is also an important point here. It's actually charged as a Class B felony, which is punishable by 5 to 15 years in prison if there is no transmission. I just want to repeat that. That means there was no harm that actually occurred, and you can be punished with 5 to 15 years in prison. This is an extremely high penalty. Um, and then if there is actual transmission, it is punishable as a Class A felony, literally on par with murder, punishable by 15 to 30 years in prison. So these are extremely draconian laws, extremely high penalties. A few points to mention here is that one, it only applies if you know your status. This is because for our criminal laws, we need to know that you had some sort of knowledge or intent to do something that the law considers wrong. But the problem here is that it actually incentivizes you to not know your status because you can't be penalized if you don't know your status. There's a lot of barriers to people getting tested often. It can be scary. People put it off for a variety of reasons, but this is another barrier that's just really contributing to people knowing their status, which, as we previously mentioned, is a really, really important component to ending the HIV epidemic. Another piece is what counts as exposure here. So the law considers exposure to be like one piece is donating organs, semen, blood products, and that piece is it's a little problematic because we actually now have the ability to like there's HIV positive organ banks, um, but in Missouri it's criminalized as a Class B felony if you attempt to donate blood if you know you're living with HIV. Luckily, we know that that piece has been prosecuted extremely rarely, but it still promotes just, I mean, really misinformation and ignorance and stigma. Other pieces are a little more obvious. Sharing needles is considered an exposing activity. Sexual activity, this piece actually goes beyond sexual activities that actually create a risk of transmission, so that's a little problematic here. But then it also covers biting, which we know actually doesn't carry any risk of transmission. Um, Another important piece here is that the law explicitly says using a condom is not a defense. So there's no incentive to actually take any risk reduction measures whatsoever. It just, across the board, if you did not disclose your status, Class B felony. In addition to this exposure law, there's also a few other places in Missouri's criminal laws where HIV is treated as an enhancement. So there's a law that's called endangering a corrections officer, where effectively there's a heightened penalty if you expose a corrections officer to certain bodily fluids. Um, if you're living with HIV or hepatitis, regardless of whether or not that bodily fluid actually carries a risk of transmission or the way in which that exposure happened actually creates a risk of transmission, just by the sheer fact that you're living with HIV or hepatitis, you receive a higher penalty. The other big piece here is sex workers living with HIV. Just by the sheer fact that they're living with HIV, if they're charged with the crime of prostitution, um, the penalty is substantially higher, like a 30 times higher penalty, just by the sheer fact that you're living with HIV. So that moves us into our legislation to address this issue. So our legislation, to be upfront, it doesn't cover all of the issues that we have with the law. That's the nature of policymaking, especially in a red state. Compromises have to be made to try to get something across the finish line. So what our law actually does, or our bill, excuse me, it would make it so that HIV is no longer singled out specifically. That's one important piece, is that HIV is treated unlike any other disease in Missouri law. It's specifically singled out for this extremely harsh treatment. Um, our, our bill would actually replace references to HIV with a general definition that, that is narrowly tailored to only cover very serious diseases. But it would make sure that we're no longer really attaching a lot of stigma in our laws to HIV specifically. The bill would also lower the penalties. We'd no longer see that Class B and Class A felony, those like on par with murder penalties. Um, and it would raise the level of intent necessary. So right now, we only need to show that someone acted recklessly as the standard. This would make it so that someone would have to know that there was a likely risk of transmission in order to be charged. Probably the most important piece, in my opinion, of this bill would make the law actually based on science. So instead of having this list of exposure activities, it would require, if a prosecutor wanted to bring these charges, they would need to prove that based on scientific evidence, there's actually a risk of transmission in whatever activity was engaged in. Because it just requires scientific evidence to prove that there was a risk of transmission, we're not going to have to go back in over and over again to kind of um, reorient the law to reflect scientific developments, which is really important because that's kind of how we ended up here. Is we have laws that were made based on the science of 20 years ago, and then there was not measures in place to make them automatically kind of stay with the times. And also there's some privacy provisions in there. As you may have followed the Michael Johnson case like 5 or so years ago. When charges are brought under these statutes, they can be highly controversial. There's a lot of stigma that's attached, and people can end up getting their like really getting a lot of media attention that they don't want. So this law would protect the privacy both of accusers and the accused, so that people would have the ability to choose for themselves whether or not they want to make their identity known if they're going through this. So there's also, that doesn't cover literally every piece. It's a very complicated statute that's being reframed, but those are some of the really key pieces of what would be done here. I'll also get into where the legislation's at right now. So as Representative Cristofanelli mentioned, we're getting to kind of a weird point in the legislature. So this is going to be kind of a crash course addendum to the Tuesday lesson on how a bill gets made. So essentially this legislation we had introduced both in the House and the Senate. It was HB 755 in the House and it was SB 65 in the Senate. Both bills had committee hearings. They were both voted out of committee unanimously. And then we really struggled to actually get them on the floor. There's a lot of kind of choke points that have to be passed in the legislative process. Even if everyone votes for a bill, at the end of the day, someone also has to put it on the calendar to get to that vote. So we were kind of struggling to get the actual time that was necessary to actually get a vote on it. So what happened just this week, very recent developments, our Senate bill, SB 65, the language from that was amended onto another bill that has already passed the House. So this bill is HB 530. It's kind of turned into this vehicle that's going to do the other tweaks to criminal justice issues. From what I've seen, are relatively minor. One would make it a little more easy to prosecute cyber stalking. Um, but now our bill has been added on to a bill that has already passed the House. It'll need to go up for another vote since it's been amended. But this has substantially raised the chances of us actually getting the bill passed into law, which is an exciting development. But it does kind of change our messaging because now we are no longer supporting HB 755 and SB 65. Instead, we need the Senate to vote in support of HB 530 if we're going to get these changes to our HIV laws across the finish line this year. So just to recap some talking points, after several years of doing this advocacy, we've kind of honed in on what's actually working in terms of what really resonates with lawmakers. And a lot of what we've learned is that they're really understanding of the idea that our laws are outdated and not based in science. They also seem to really get that singling out HIV specifically is not the best way to make policy. Other talking points that I think are really important to keep bringing up, even though they don't seem to resonate quite as much as the first two. But what's really important is these laws don't work. These laws were enacted in order to prevent transmission, but we have absolutely no evidence that that's actually happening. If anything, it's creating barriers to public health strategies. As I mentioned, it creates a disincentive to getting tested. It also contributes to stigma and fear, which actually decreases the risk or decreases the chances that you're actually going to disclose your status to partners if you are living with HIV, which is literally the opposite of what these laws were intended to do. Another piece as well is there's very, very broad consensus amongst experts that these laws are not good public health policy, ranging from the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the Department of Justice. There's just a broad range of medical professionals and organizations that agree that these laws are really, really bad. It looks like I'm a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think we're going to go ahead and move into the action steps. So what we want to do today is call our senators and or email our senators to let them know that they should support HB 530 specifically in order to modernize our HIV laws. And then if you want to add on a social media post as well, I think that could be really helpful. Right now, the social media, because of the kind of change in strategy that happened, I can't emphasize how recently this happened, like literally within days. So a lot of our social media has been around HB 755 and SB 65. So kind of shifting that language to HB 530, I think will be helpful. It's so recent though that the new version of HB 530 actually has not hit the public officially yet. So the timing of this is is a little odd, but I think getting that shift to the bill that'll actually carry these proposed updates, I think is going to be really important. So just some resources. I believe I have trouble accessing the chat when we are sharing screen. But I believe the chat, there is a, yes, some sample phone scripts, emails, and social media. Ideally, it's preferable if you kind of personalize those messages, but I know that it can sometimes be a barrier to like not wanting to get started. So we started some scripts there initially just to kind of get you on the right foot if that was going to stand in the way. And then there's also a link in there to help you identify who your senator is if you don't know already. I'm going to stay on the line so that people can ask questions or anything while we are taking that time to reach out to senators. But at this last kind of final moment, I wanted to plug our social media. So for Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, I've included here both the HIV Justice Coalition specifically, and then also Empower Missouri. If you're not following any and all of those platforms that you're on, this would be a great time to make sure you're plugged in on the social media front. And then also I wanted to plug, we have a new microsite that our media and messaging committee has been working really hard on. It's that mohivjustice.org. If you go to that website, that is a great place to learn more about what we're doing. And there's also a place that you can insert your information if you want to get more plugged into the coalition on an ongoing basis. Sign up. We will reach out to you, get you onto the mailing list. There's also an email address here, the mohivjustice@empowermissouri.org. That's also a great way to contact the coalition directly, and we will get you plugged in to get you more involved in the work going forward.